Why, despite everything, the Bible still makes sense, brackets, of everything. There's a lot in there, isn't there? That's a big title, a lot of assumptions in there. So, what are we going to do with it? Let's begin with the idea of making sense and use that as a way into trying to do something with this title. And I want to ask all of you individually a question, not to answer out loud, but to think about in your own heads. How do you make sense of everything, of your life, of your own existence? What are the mental tools that you bring to bear on finding meaning in life? And also, where did those tools come from? Like, what's the story of how you got to the point where you are now, making sense of the world in the way that you do? Is the way that you make sense of the world sort of your own idea? Did you come up with the schema yourself? It's very unlikely that that's the case. It's usually a sort of cultural osmosis, isn't it? There are ideas floating around there in the culture, and we grab some of them and we put them together and we try and make sense of life that way. For some of us, we will make sense of life because other people made sense of life in a particular way. For some of us, that might be, look, our parents sort of thought the world worked in this particular way, and so I sort of found myself, without thinking about it, understanding the world in a very similar way. For others of us, it might be, my parents made sense of the world in one way, so I knew that was not going to be the way that I made sense of the world. And in a sense, your parents are still defining you, aren't they, in that sense? But they're defining you in the negative. They are that against which you're defining yourself. So they're still sort of controlling the way you make sense of the world, but it's in a negative way rather than in a positive way. And there'll be some overlaps, I'm sure, in different people in the room. Like, we will all have commonalities in the way that we make sense of everything, and there'll be differences as well. No doubt if we had time, and it would be a fascinating exercise to sort of pass a microphone around everybody and say, to the extent that you understand yourself, how do you think you do make sense of the world? There'll be some really different ideas. We can't deal in one evening with all the different ways we make sense of the world, so I want to pick on one of the major ones and think about it together with you for a while. And it's the idea that we make sense of the world, you and I, through stories. And we see ourselves as part of these stories, as characters in these stories. And that's how we have a sense of where we came from and where we're going and what meaning our life has. And some of these stories are pretty widespread in our society. So, for example, you can't watch many TV shows or watch many online videos without coming across the idea that you shouldn't allow anybody to tell you who you are. You should follow your dreams, and if you work hard enough, you will achieve whatever you set your mind to achieve. That's a common story in our culture today that many people use to make sense of their lives. It's not a universal story. It's actually quite a peculiar sort of story, historically speaking and culturally speaking, to have, but it's one of the ones that's dominant in our society. So we pick these stories that are lurking around in society, and we use them in order to make sense of our own lives. I want to pick on one particular story that has been making sense of everything for people for about 300 years now. And I think it's one of the dominant stories, and I'm going to try and show you how I think it still shapes the way that lots of people see society today. It's a story that goes by the name of the state of nature. And it's got a sort of quite a, nerdy philosophical beginning, but then I think it's got some really quite profound and general consequences as well. So let me do the nerdy stuff first. In the middle of the 17th century, Thomas Hobbes, the early modern philosopher, writes a series of books, some in the 1640s, some in the 1650s, culminating in the final formulation of his political philosophy in the book Leviathan. And over a series of 3 books, he develops this idea that came to be known as the state of nature. Now, if you want to score nerd points, he doesn't actually use the term state of nature in Leviathan. He uses it in De Sive that was published a few years earlier, but it's the state of nature word that stuck, so that's the one I'm going to use. And his idea is basically, and I'm about to insult you and I apologize in advance for doing so, that you and I are really quite awful. We're driven by three things and three things alone. A lust for competition. I am inevitably in competition with you. Either you win or I win, but we can't both win. We're all in competition with each other. So face up to it, says Hobbes. We're driven by what he calls diffidence, which is basically fear. I'm scared of you, and I want to protect myself against you, and I have all sorts of sophisticated ways of doing that. You do that to me as well. And we're driven by glory, which means we want to be seen to be better than everybody else. I want to be the one up there, literally. Now, this is a very live issue for me, on the stage, that everyone's looking at. I want to be the center of attention. And he said that drives us, and that's us. That's all you need to know about human beings. And if you understand human beings in that way, we are in a war of all against all, inevitable. You can't avoid it. And life, in that state, he says, is, and this is the famous quotation, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Not the sort of guy you'd want to invite over for dinner, I think, Mr. Hobbes. But that was his view of human nature. And the only way of rescuing ourselves from the inevitable destruction of that situation is to have some sort of despotic ruler over everybody who keeps us all in awe. It's the strong arm of government that stops us killing each other, basically. So unless you have a strong government, it's chaos, it's anarchy. So you need a despotic ruler. He calls the ruler Leviathan to rule over everybody. That's his state of nature. And then about a century later, another guy comes along, French guy, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who uses the same language, state of nature, but thinks about it really, really, really differently. So for Rousseau, all you need to know about human beings is, again, two things. One of them is that we want to preserve our own lives, not in a nasty way, not at the expense of your life, but, we prefer to stay alive rather than die, given the choice. And secondly, we have pity for each other. So when you suffer, I feel compassion for you when I see you suffering. When an animal suffers, actually, I feel compassion for the animal. And that's basic human nature for Rousseau. And all the other stuff is bells and whistles around that. And therefore, if people are like that, the state of nature is really quite a nice place to be. It's actually better, says Rousseau, than this, because it's society that stuffs us up and that forces us to be in competition with each other. That's not natural for Rousseau. It forces me to seek glory. It forces me to want to be the person on the stage, not the person sitting down, because that's the position of glory. He says that's not natural. I want that because society is conditioning me. So for Hobbes, it's society that saves us from ourselves, and for Rousseau, it's society that stuffs us up and messes around with this beautiful human nature inside us, which is we just pity each other and want to keep on living. Really simple. And so you've got these two fundamental streams, two ways of seeing human beings, two stories that we use to make sense of life. And let me show you how we use those stories today. So you've got on the one side your contemporary 21st century Hobbesians, chief among whom is a guy called Steven Pinker, as a sort of prominent public intellectual. He's written a whole bunch of books. And in 2016, he wrote a book called The Blank Slate. And in that book, he discusses this state of nature idea. And he says Rousseau was basically a hopeless romantic. He wants us to be nice, but we're not nice. We all know we're not nice. Look at the history of the world. It's not a nice history. Basically, Hobbes was right. And for Pinker, the Enlightenment has saved us, has saved civilization from the worst instincts in ourselves, and therefore we need to hold on very preciously to this wonderful Western civilization that we've made for ourselves so that we don't redescend into a state of nature. And this is a certain view of humanity where we basically need keeping down. We need civilizing. Otherwise, all hell breaks loose. And so in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, a guy called Timothy Garton-Ash writes an article in the Guardian newspaper, I think it was, where he says basically the chaos that happened after Katrina, the looting and so forth, is proof of Hobbes' state of nature. And he uses this language of a thin veneer of society. You scratch this thin veneer of society, a natural disaster happens, normal ways of policing ourselves are sort of put out of action, and look what happens to people, he said. Look how nasty we are when we get the opportunity to do so. And this is a modern-day Hobbesianism. And there are lots more examples that we could find. People are basically nasty. We need to protect ourselves against each other, and we need to keep our instincts down with government. I found this as I was preparing the talk. I found this on a little box of coffee, ground coffee pouches in the canteen on the university building where I work. So this is the philosophy department's coffee, okay? So they're to blame for this. Look what they've written on it. Please do not remove, you are on camera. Extraordinary thing to say. What's the assumption there? If you know you're not going to get caught, we know you're going to steal this coffee. We know the only thing that's going to stop you doing it is if someone sees and shames you. It's the only thing that's going to stop you. If you think you can get away with it, you will, because we're Hobbesian. And we know that you're nasty. And you'll do whatever you can if you're not caught. So watch out, you're on camera. Don't dare steal our little pouch of coffee. It's modern-day Hobbesianism, isn't it? People need keeping down. People need surveillance. Otherwise, they're going to run amok. And then you get your modern-day Rousseauians. One sort of example of this is a guy called Rutger Bregman, who wrote a book called Humankind, sort of pun in the term humankind. And his thesis is that basically Rousseau was right. And he thinks that society started to go wrong between 10 and 15,000 years ago. So while we were still nomadic, everything was great, sort of a very Rousseauian vibe. And then we started settling down and planting crops and living together in conurbations, and society reared its ugly head, and we became the nasty people that we are today. So basically, he calls, and he uses this word in the book, society is a curse. It's a curse that we need to get ourselves out from under. That's the way that we deal with our state, not by keeping us under the cosh of a despotic rule, but by getting society out of the way, letting us be the wonderful people that we naturally are before we're messed up by society. And recently we've found that there's also a pushback against both of these ideas. So you've got your Hobbesians, you've got your Rousseauians. You've got a third group, really interestingly as well. There was a best-selling book released a couple of years ago called The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and David Wengrow. And their big thesis, and they mainly pick on Rousseau, but they also take Hobbes down in doing the same thing, is that this whole idea of this single story, either we start good and society messes us up, or we start bad and society rescues us from ourselves, that structure of the story is the problem. They say it's not as easy as that. It's not that we used to be nomadic and it was good and then we settled down. They say historically it seems that nomadism was a sort of came in and out and there wasn't one moment where everything changed. So in order to liberate ourselves from the false ideology of this story, we need to just leave the state of nature behind altogether. But there's a problem with that. Because at the very moment that they're rejecting, as they think, the logic of the state of nature, as in things were really bad, something happened that rescued us, it became good, the Hobbesian state of nature, they're doing exactly the same thing. We used to believe in this state of nature idea, and that was really bad, and that was messing us up as a society. Now we've come along, hello, David Graeber and David Wengrow, and we are rescuing you from that, and now you no longer believe that story, and everything's wonderful. You see, they're parasitic upon the logic of the position they're dismissing in the moment that they're dismissing it. They still believe in progress. In the state of a before and an after, they've just changed around the content of that progress. Now it's bad to believe in any state of nature, and we liberate ourselves, we become more fully human by not believing in the state of nature. There's also a more radical version of this rejection, and this is the last one, don't worry, I'm going to sort of turn off nerd mode in about 30 seconds. But just to give you a full picture of the different options out there, because otherwise you think, well, there are more things that you haven't mentioned, so I just want to name check them. The radical version of rejecting this is Michel Foucault's position, which is that there's no discernible progress. To talk of progress across history is a fiction. There are changes. There are moments when we used to think in this way, and then things changed, then we thought in that way, and then a little while later they changed and we thought in this way. But you can't string them together and say that we're either better off than we used to be or we're worse off than we used to be. For Foucault, that is ideological. You can't do that. Because how else can you judge things other than by the rules of the period in which you find yourself? And obviously you're going to be the best. Like, who's going to live in a period of society where we think, oh, everything was just so wonderful back in the Stone Age, and now, we've mucked everything up. People don't work like that. So you can't trust yourself to make a judgment on which is best. So those are your options. Your Hobbesians, your Rousseauians, your anti-state of nature, Graeber and Wengrow, but we're still going to keep progress, people, and your more radical rejection of it with Foucault. Now, I don't know how you reacted to those stories as I was quickly telling you them, but I think my reaction certainly, and let me know in Q&A whether you agree, is that, look, there's sort of something in all of those, really. Like, I wouldn't be completely sold out on any of them, but human beings can be pretty nasty to each other. Like, you just take 20th century history and, you can see how you could see bits of Hobbesianism in there. Like, we have not always been really nice to each other. And similarly with Rousseau, you look back again just at the 20th century, and people can be really, really nice to each other. Like, people can give their lives for other people they've never met, that are not in their ethnic group, that are not in their family. Like, things that you'd not really have a reason to do, other than you're just a really, really good person. And people do that. And so there is a sense in which you see resonances of Rousseau. And also with the anti-state of nature people. Like, both of these stories just seem a bit too simple, don't they? And therefore you have sympathy with them. You say, no, you can't just say that Hobbesianism explains everything or Rousseauianism explains everything. It's got to be more complex than that. And therefore these different stories make sense, I'm suggesting to you, you may or may not agree, of some things. Hobbesianism makes some sense of some things, really quite well, and other things it doesn't make that much sense of. And Rousseauianism, similarly, makes some sense of some things, and there are other things that it doesn't quite make sense of in the same way. I want to now compare those ideas to another idea of origins, on which I think the state of nature theories are themselves parasitic, and again we can talk about this in Q&A if you want, which is, of course, the biblical account of origins in Genesis 1-3. I just want to make a few quick points about the biblical account to try and get a conversation going between these different state of nature stories and what the Bible says. So the first thing that I want to suggest is that there's a peculiarity in the account of human origins in Genesis 1-3 that none of these other stories really have. And it's, and stay with me, this is going to sound really simplistic to begin with, but hopefully we'll see why it really matters. That Genesis 1 is not the same as Genesis 3. There's something that happens between Genesis 1 and Genesis 3 that introduces a rupture into the history of humanity. I want to try and take a few minutes to explain why I think that is so incredibly important. First of all, let me talk about the nature of that rupture. So, Genesis 1, to run through it really quickly and in an almost caricatural way, God creates a world in which all relationships work really very well indeed. Relationships with him seem to be unimpeded. Relationships between human beings, between Adam and Eve, seem really very good. And relationships with the rest of the world are really quite fine. So it's a good situation to begin with. And then what happens in Genesis 3, to cut a long story short, is that all of those relationships get messed up. To use a 20th century term, alienation is introduced between God and humanity. Human beings create coverings for themselves because they're now ashamed. There's alienation between Adam and Eve. There's alienation with the rest of creation. All those relationships are twisted. But there isn't any sense in Genesis 1-3 that Genesis 3, the fall, undoes everything that was done in Genesis 1. So we don't go back to a situation before creation. It's not an utter uncreation. It's a twisting and a distorting and a warping of things within creation. And therefore there's, if you like, an asymmetry between the creation and the fall. Creation comes first, and fall messes around with creation, but it doesn't completely undo it. And this is incredibly important in terms of making sense of the world. First of all, because it shows that the origin of good is different, temporally distinct from the entrance of evil into the world. And the philosopher Paul Ricoeur says that this is, if you look at all the different religions and philosophies and ways of thinking about the world, this is one of the most radical attempts to distinguish the origin of good from the origin of evil, to divide the two. And therefore, to say that evil does not go all the way down and all the way back in our society, in our world. But there's a contingency, there's a boundedness to evil that's not exactly the same as the existence of good. And we're going to see a little bit later why that's incredibly important. So there's this asymmetry between good and evil. And what that allows the person who's trying to make sense of life through a Christian lens, through a biblical lens, to do is to have, so to speak, a multi-lens engagement with reality, a multi-lens anthropology, if you like. And if we had time to go through the rest of the Bible, of course, we could see that, Genesis 3 is not the final chapter in the Bible, thank goodness. And there are more lenses to do with redemption and then consummation at the end. But let's just stick with creation and fall, because I think I can say what I need to say from that without burdening you guys with extra material. And therefore, the Christian can say, because people in Genesis 1 are created in the image of God, and God is a good God, it should not be surprising to us when people are capable of really very astounding, jaw-dropping acts of kindness and goodness. That's what you'd expect of people created in God's image. But because Genesis 3 happened and all our relationships are alienated, and we no longer perfectly reflect the image of the God in whose image we were created, it's no huge surprise. I mean, it's saddening, it's devastating, we weep over it, but it's not a surprise that people can be very, very, very nasty, including you and including me, to each other. It doesn't shock our view of the world. It doesn't threaten our view of the world. It's a tragedy, but it doesn't threaten our view of the world. And what the Christian position does is it manages, I think, therefore, to take everything that resonates with us about Hobbes. People can be really competitive and angry and self-seeking, and everything that resonates with us about Rousseau. No, people are really quite nice very often, and we're not trying to kill each other all the time, and make sense of both of those without just sort of having some woolly compromise in the middle. It can make sense of both of those because it has these two different lenses through which reality is viewed. And also, in the rest of the biblical story, I think it wouldn't be hard to make the case for the messiness of those who deny the state of nature narrative as well. The Bible's story is complex, isn't it? Think of Ecclesiastes and Proverbs. What sort of world do we live in? Proverbs, world that makes sense. Ecclesiastes, world that doesn't make sense. Well, which one is it? Well, that's both of them. Because sometimes you wake up in the morning and you feel like Proverbs. The world is at your feet. You put the effort in, you get the prize. And some days you wake up in the morning and it feels like Ecclesiastes, and you never get out of your pajamas all day. You wonder why you're doing it to begin with. Because the effort that you put in was never recognized, and the person who put no effort in seems to have climbed to the top. So why bother? Both of those are true, aren't they? It's a complex view of reality as well. So we've got this idea of a double-lensed, a multi-lensed anthropology. And so if you want to represent this, if you're a visual thinker, you want to represent this diagrammatically, you imagine Hobbes here on the left. Human beings are defined by a baseline fear and selfishness, and we need a common power to keep us all in awe. That's Leviathan chapter 13 in a nutshell. And Rousseau on the other side says, the baseline humanity is empathy and pity. We're really, really very good deep down. And we just need to let society get out of the way and let us be ourselves. That's how you solve this. Well, you can't fit the biblical story into either of those boxes very snugly, can you? It doesn't fit within either of those stories. And so, to speak, it cuts across both of them. There's elements that are recognizable from Hobbesianism in it, but not in the way that Hobbes thought, and there are elements that are recognizable from Rousseauianism in it, but not as Rousseau thought. And so what you find is that both Hobbes and Rousseau have sort of dismembered the biblical narrative. They've ripped bits of biblical truth apart from other bits, where they sit quite happily together in the Bible. They've made those dismembered limbs, so to speak, the whole truth. So for Hobbes, basically, Genesis 4 to 11 is the whole truth. Cain killing Abel and Lamech being a misogynistic braggart. And, people, as it says, later on in Genesis 6, that everything people did was evil all the time. That's Hobbes. He's right there. Those are Hobbes' chapters. And, Rousseau is right there in Genesis 1 and 2. Everything's wonderful and relationships work well and people are good and people are loving each other. And neither of them are able to see the whole story. And so my contention, I guess, is that the Bible makes more comprehensive sense, you could say. It makes richer sense. It makes more multi-dimensional sense of everything than either the stock Hobbesianism or the stock Rousseauism of our cultural landscape today are able to. Not only that, also the biblical position, and this is why that disjunction between creation and fall is really, really important, allows you to have, I'm going to put this in nerdy terms and then translate them out of Nerdville. So it allows you to have a normative critique of society, which means it allows you to say, in a way that means more than I have a feeling about this, that some things are unjust. Okay? The biblical position allows you to say, regardless of what I think about it, and actually regardless of what anyone else in the world, so if everybody in the world agreed that something was just, it could still be the reality that that thing is unjust. Because it's not dependent on what we perceive it to be, it's dependent on something outside of us. And it allows us to say that the way things are now, after the fall, before the second coming, in these last days, is not the way they were originally created. This is not the world as it was originally meant to be, nor is it the world as it will finally be, as God will wrap things up in the end. And therefore, from within the Christian story, because of this rupture between creation and fall, and then another rupture with redemption, we can say things are not right in the world today, and things are unjust. And those things are unjust whether we think they are or not, whether someone agrees with them or not, and they should be changed. And you might think, well, surely everyone can say that. Let me suggest why it's much harder to come to that position from within a situation where you don't have a break between creation and fall. Because if there are no ruptures in history in this way, if the way that things are is just simply the way that things are, and they change gradually over time, but there's no fundamental ruptures, then you have no reference outside of the way things are against which to measure the way things are. Unless you've got something to measure it against, you don't know whether it's good or evil, or just or unjust, right or wrong. You might have a feeling, you might have a gut feeling, but that's all you've got. And if your gut feeling is different to my gut feeling, the only way to resolve that is for me to speak louder and longer than you and try, if I can, to stop you speaking. That's the only way of resolving it, because there's nothing outside both of us to suggest what is in fact unjust. Because they're simply the way things are. It's like bootstrapping yourself. Any criterion of justice that you try and think of is itself part of the way things are, isn't it? So it's circular. And so if you say things as they are ought not to be the case, well, why should the thing that you're talking about, among all the things that there are, not be the case? Why should it not be the criterion in your own head that is also part of the way things are? Why should that bit of the way things are not be the case? Why is that not the unjust bit? It's really complex to try and drive a normative critique of society if the way things are is all that there is. Let me give you an example. In the Ancien Régime in France, before the French Revolution, there was this argument, and it was, how should we organize society? Well, look up in the heavens. There's one sun, and we've got all the planets going around the sun. Okay, good, right? Well, so there's a natural way for things to be. That's our model. So we're going to have one king, and the whole society revolves around the king. This is Louis XIV. It was called the Sun King, largely for this reason. And, well, that's natural, isn't it? We're reflecting the way things really are in the way that we do society. And then someone like a 20th century philosopher, Gilles Deleuze, comes along. And he has this complex way of viewing reality that basically says difference is fundamental. Not identity, but difference. And so we should valorize difference. in our politics and in our understanding of culture. Now, radically different positions, but it's the same move, isn't it? This thing is the way things really are. Solar system is the way things really are. Difference, fundamental difference is the way things really are. Therefore, we should organize things that way. Now, the problem with that is there are countless ways things are. And which one are you going to pick? You're going to do the solar system thing? Absolute monarchy is the way to go. You're going to do the difference thing? Difference proliferation is the way to go. Or are you going to do a third thing? Like, what bit of the way things are you going to choose to base your ethics on? And why not another bit? And I don't think it's possible to answer that question from within a view of the world where what there is simply what there is. Because it's just more of what there is, talking about what there is, deciding what there should be. It doesn't make sense. You've got to have this rupture in history to have a standpoint outside the status quo to make the judgment about justice meaningful. And so this diagram seeks to represent that visually. Now, so this is the biblical view. Creation, there's a rupture, that's that wiggly line going down. Something qualitatively changes. It's not just the outworking of what was there before in the fall. Something really definitive happens. And then something else really definitive happens with what theologians have called the Christ event, the incarnation, death, resurrection, ascension of Christ. That is another rupture in history. And it's really interesting that towards the end of one of his books of cultural critique, the German, broadly speaking, Marxist philosopher, the member of the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, Theodor Adorno, at the end of Minima Moralia, he says, in order to meaningfully critique society, you need, this is his language, a standpoint of redemption. Now, he's not a Christian, and he's not making the case for Christianity there. He just finds that an appropriate language to reach for, to talk about this place to stand outside the status quo, without which you can't judge the status quo meaningfully. I just think it's really interesting that he reaches for a theological idiom at that point, because this is precisely what the Bible provides, a standpoint of redemption, a standpoint of how things are when they're working well, against which we can look at our society and say, well, this is not that, therefore this is not good, this is not just, things are not as they ought to be at the moment. And without the sort of history that the Bible gives you with these qualitative ruptures, it is, if you want to be rigorous, if you want to do it properly, really, really hard to get a standpoint of redemption. Because, you're just a person of water in an ocean of water, surrounded by water, making a ladder of water to get yourself out of the water. Like, you can't get any purchase, you can't get any friction. Because what there is what there is what there is, and you're part of it. So any thought you have is part of what there is. How are you going to get a lever on that? And so, the Christian, I think, finds herself in the position where she can make, I don't know how to describe it, sort of healthier sense of everything than other people. Well, let me tell you what I think, and then you can tell me in the discussion time afterwards whether you think this works or not. So there are two broad currents in society at the moment. There are nuances and differences and other things going on, but these are two of the dominant ones. One of them is a sort of general pessimism, I guess, particularly in the face of climate change. There's a sense of, well, we do what we want, but we passed the tipping point. We ain't going to change anything. In Australia, where I live, there's a sense of, I think, dissolution among young people over house prices. I don't know whether that's the case here or not, but certainly there's a sense, well, I'm never going to own a house. I don't care how hard I work. I can work 24 hours a day. I'm not going to get a house. Nothing can change, basically. We're stuck with a degrading, decrepit world. It's gradually getting worse and worse, certainly getting worse with climate change. There's nothing we can do about it. And it's a terrible burden, isn't it, to live with that view of the world. And it leads to a quietism and often a parochialism. I think some of the nationalisms that we're seeing bubbling up are a response to, a knee-jerk response to that sense of things are out of control. Things are we're not able to change anything on a global scale. And then, on the other hand, you've got another current of thinking these days, which is sort of almost a wild-eyed utopian, isn't it? Like, if we just get education right, then we're going to have the society that we want. If we just get the right people in government, and keep them there for long enough, then we're going to get the society that we want. We can fix this if we try really, really hard and work really, really assiduously towards that goal. The problem with this view historically, thinking that we can fix things if we try hard enough, is that it has often tended, as a matter of historical fact, to lead to violence. Because if you don't get the society you want, you think, I must not be trying hard enough. What can I do in addition to what I'm doing to bring about the society that I want? So, for example, after the French Revolution, Maximilien Robespierre is faced with the situation in the country that it's not the Rousseauian paradise that he might have wished it to be. So what do? Well, there are these aristocrats. They're the ones who are holding us back. And I know this is really awkward, but if we get rid of them, then we'll have the society that everybody wants. And because that goal is so vast and good and long-lasting, it's worth the bloodshed to do it. So it's not, we enjoy killing aristocrats. It's what is held out in front of us if we do this is so good for so many people that it's worth it. And then that logic starts to creep in. It didn't work in the French Revolution. It didn't work in the killing fields of Cambodia. And it didn't work in so many other examples throughout history. And so where does the Christian place herself? Is the Christian basically a pessimist? I can't change anything. Or is the Christian basically a utopian? If we just work hard enough, we're going to get things right. Well, I want to suggest that the biblical storyline that I've been setting out makes the Christian more pessimistic than the pessimist and more utopian than the utopian for the following reasons. So the pessimist says, we've tried changing society. We've had this government, we've had the other government, we've had the first people back, we've had the second people back, nothing's changed. The Bible comes along and says, you have no idea how deep the problem goes. The problem is not with who's in power. The problem isn't fundamentally even about emission levels. It's a symptom, it's not the cause. The problem is that people have turned away from God, and that is a heart issue. And you can throw as much money as you want, over as many years as you want, you are not going to scratch the surface of that problem. That little adage, isn't it? The heart of the human problem is the problem of the human heart. If you let that sink in, that is a dark place to be. So you can't solve it. Because anyone who seeks to solve it is by definition part of the problem. I am part of the problem. And I'm going to bring that into any solution that I find. It's a very dark view of the prospect of social change. But also, the Christian finds herself more utopian than the utopian. Because look at the extent of the utopian's vision. What do you want to do? Well, we want a society of freedom and equality. And perhaps if we're French, also fraternity. But basically, we want a society where everything works really, really well and people get on with each other and everyone's happy. The Christian comes along and says, how small is that vision? Let me cast a vision for you that includes not only the restoration of all those things in society and more, but actually justice for those who throughout their lives never saw those things. Justice for the dead. This is what Revelation says, the book of Revelation in the Bible, isn't it? Everything that was done in secret will be brought out into the open. So that person who was abused when they were a child, that nobody ever knew about, but it ruined their life, justice will be exacted for that, even if it happened 300 years ago. They will not get away with it. Justice for the dead. No one is promising that. No utopian is promising that in the world today. That is a level of justice that even dwarfs the wildest political dreams of any political agenda in the world today. And yet it's basic biblical Christianity. Any vision of justice that falls short of that is like, C.S. Lewis's thing of making mud pies in the slum, because you've no idea of what it might look like to have a holiday at the beach. And surely any justice short of that is short of full justice, isn't it? So the Christian finds herself more cynical than the greatest cynic and more utopian than the greatest utopian because she's viewing the world through this biblical story, making sense of life through this story. So let me wrap up really quickly. I've made two arguments, a weak one and a strong one. The weak argument is that it just so happens, I believe, that Christianity makes sense of everything in a richer and more existentially satisfying way than other options out there today. The second stronger argument is any option that seeks to make sense of society in a way that critiques the way things are, that can say this is not right, there's something in society that's not right, is borrowing from a biblical way of looking at the world. It's borrowing this idea of a standpoint of redemption that is baked into the biblical way of looking at things, but it's very hard to get to if you don't have the sort of story that the Bible has. So 2 sentences as I close. Sentence number 1. They're both sentences to the skeptic. I have no idea what you're thinking, or even if you're listening. If you're not, wake up. I'm nearly finished, so it's a good time to pretend you've been paying attention. No one will notice. The first sentence is that it's not only Christians who have been saying things like this. I just want to give you 2 examples of people who are by no means card-carrying Christians who have made these same arguments. So the first one is Friedrich Nietzsche. And in The Happy Science, he has this paragraph. He says, "It is still a metaphysical faith upon which our faith in science rests. Even we knowers of today, we godless anti-metaphysicians, still take our fire, too, from the flame lit by the 1,000-year-old faith." So he's recognizing this standpoint of redemption principle. If we want to say meaningful things about the world, critique the way that things are, we have to be borrowing from this Christian legacy, this 1,000-year-old faith, as he talks about it. And the second witness is Carl Schmitt, who grew up a Catholic, but by the time he wrote these words, he was a very thoroughgoing atheist. And he says, "All significant concepts of the modern theory of the state are secularized theological concepts, not only because of their historical development, in other words, not merely de facto, it doesn't simply happen to be the case that these are theological concepts, but also because of their systematic structure. In other words, it is necessarily so, the recognition of which is necessary for sociological consideration of these concepts." So there's a crowd of witnesses, if you like, sort of testifying to the stuff that I've been saying, and some of them are not by any means Christian. The second thing is that if you're skeptical, first of all, well done. I spend half my working life encouraging my students to be more skeptical than they are. So you're starting actually from quite a healthy standpoint. I think there's far too little skepticism in many ways in our society. We take the ideas floating around in our society for granted much too easily, so well done. But secondly, could I please encourage you to be consistent in your skepticism? And not arbitrary or capricious in what you choose to be skeptical about. In other words, be as skeptical of your own skepticism and as suspicious of your motives for it as you are for anything else. Not more, not less, but just the same amount as you would be skeptical, for example, of the claims that I'm making. Then your skepticism will be consistent and there'll be a level playing field and we can really talk about how these different ideas work.